The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was thick with tension, as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone. C-SPAN cameras swept across the chamber, capturing the filled gallery and the line of witnesses at the long oak table. At the center sat Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who had taken the unusual step of appearing before the committee to defend his controversial legislative agenda. Just moments earlier, Johnson had delivered a polished 20-minute statement on constitutional principles and the separation of powers. Speaking with the assurance of a former constitutional attorney, he lectured the committee about the founders' intent and claimed his leadership was restoring proper constitutional balance. Republican members nodded in agreement, while Democrats exchanged skeptical glances. Chairman Jim Jordan then announced, "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes." The tone of the room subtly changed. Johnson smiled politely as he turned toward Crockett, but his fingers tightened slightly around his pen. What followed would surprise everyone in the room. With one carefully crafted 27-word question, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett would dismantle Speaker Johnson's argument, expose a deep contradiction in his constitutional reasoning, and leave him momentarily speechless before a national audience. By the time her 5 minutes ended, Johnson's credibility had taken a visible hit, and the exchange was already spreading rapidly across social media. Before examining how Crockett managed to do this with a single question, the host reminded viewers to subscribe and comment where they were watching from, promising future breakdowns of major Washington confrontations often ignored by mainstream media. This clash had been building for months. The contrast between the two lawyer-turned-politicians could not have been more pronounced. Speaker Mike Johnson, 52, had built his image as a staunch constitutional conservative. Before entering Congress, he worked as an attorney for the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian legal organization. His sudden rise to Speaker after his predecessor's ouster had surprised many, with colleagues crediting his appointment to his reputation as a constitutional scholar, capable of guiding the party through legal complexities. Since taking the gavel, Johnson had frequently cited his legal background when promoting his policies. As a constitutional lawyer of over 2 decades, he often opened statements by referencing his credentials. On television, he was introduced as a constitutional expert, and his office walls displayed framed copies of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, symbols reinforcing his brand as a legal, traditionalist congresswoman. Jasmine Crockett presented a starkly different story. At 42, the freshman representative from Texas joined Congress after serving in the state legislature. Before politics, she made her name as a civil rights attorney, representing clients in police misconduct cases and advocating for voting rights. While Johnson emphasized original intent and strict textualism, Crockett focused on how constitutional principles applied to modern realities. The hearing had been called to examine Johnson's legislative agenda, which Democrats argued violated several constitutional provisions, despite his insistence on fidelity to the founding text. Confident in his expertise, Johnson came well prepared with binders full of notes and historical references. He expected routine partisan questioning, not the targeted challenge Crockett had planned. Unbeknownst to him, Crockett had spent the previous night meticulously studying his legal career, public remarks, and voting record. While most Democrats intended to focus on policy disagreements, she aimed for something deeper, exposing a contradiction between his declared constitutional philosophy and his actual record. The implications extended far beyond this hearing. This was a broader contest over constitutional authority, over who defined it and whose interpretation would shape public understanding. For Johnson, his image as a constitutional authority was essential to his leadership. For Crockett, revealing inconsistencies in his views would directly weaken that foundation. As she arranged her notes, the room quieted. Republicans appeared relaxed, trusting the speaker's ability to handle the questioning. Democrats leaned forward, curious. None realized how one question would soon shift the entire tone of the hearing. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, her voice steady. "And thank you, Mr. Speaker, for joining us today. Before I ask my main question, I'd like to clarify a few points for the record regarding your legal philosophy." Johnson nodded confidently. "Of course, Congresswoman. You've described yourself as a constitutional originalist and textualist, correct?" Crockett asked. "Yes, Johnson replied. I believe the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original public meaning when it was ratified, and you've often stated that it should not be treated as a living document that evolves with time or social values, correct? That's right, he affirmed. The Constitution has a fixed meaning. If change is needed, it must come through the amendment process, not through reinterpretation. Crockett nodded, taking notes. So it's fair to say you believe this originalist approach must be applied consistently to all parts of the Constitution? Absolutely, Johnson said firmly. Consistency is key. We can't selectively apply principles based on politics. With those answers, Crockett had built the foundation of her argument. Johnson had stepped directly into her line of questioning. Thank you for clarifying, Crockett continued calmly. I have one substantive question. She paused briefly as the cameras focused on both of them, then asked the question that would silence the room. Given your commitment to strict originalism, can you explain why you believe the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms, when the Supreme Court didn't interpret it that way until 2008, in District of Columbia versus Heller, over 200 years after ratification? The room went silent. Committee members exchanged glances at the unexpected turn. It wasn't a policy question. It was a direct challenge to the foundation of Johnson's philosophy. Johnson blinked, his confident expression fading. He reached for his water, pausing before answering. Well, Congresswoman, the Heller decision simply reaffirmed what was always true, that the Second Amendment has always protected an individual right. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting, Mr. Speaker, because for over 2 centuries after ratification, federal courts consistently ruled the Second Amendment protected a collective right tied to militia service, not an individual right. If you're an originalist, shouldn't you accept that original interpretation? The question landed precisely as intended. Some Republican members shifted uncomfortably. Crockett had turned Johnson's own principles against him. Johnson's reply came faster but sounded defensive. Those earlier courts were mistaken. The text is clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's an individual right. So, Crockett replied evenly, you believe courts can be wrong about the Constitution's original meaning for over 200 years? That appears to conflict with the originalist view, which maintains that the Constitution's meaning was fixed at ratification and should be clear to anyone who studies the historical record. Crockett continued before Johnson could reply. And if we're focusing strictly on the text, as you've suggested, the full Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The militia clause seems central to the original understanding, doesn't it? The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. What had begun as a routine oversight hearing had evolved into a pointed discussion of constitutional theory, where the self-proclaimed expert was struggling to defend his consistency. Democratic members watched closely, intrigued, while several Republicans flipped hurriedly through their notes in search of something that might help the speaker. Johnson adjusted his tie, his earlier composure replaced by unease. The militia clause is prefatory, not limiting, he said. It introduces a purpose but doesn't restrict the right. Justice Scalia made this clear in Heller. Yes, in 2008. Crockett noted evenly. But we're discussing the original understanding at the time of ratification. If originalism is correct, how could courts, scholars, and lawmakers misinterpret this supposedly clear right for more than 2 centuries? Doesn't that challenge the claim that the Constitution's meaning is fixed and easily understood? Johnson had been led into a no-win situation. If he insisted the Second Amendment always protected an individual right despite 200 years of contrary rulings, he weakened his own claim that constitutional meaning is clear and fixed. But if he admitted that understanding evolves over time, he would contradict the very foundation of originalism. Either way, his image as a consistent constitutional scholar was collapsing in real time. He looked toward Chairman Jordan, perhaps hoping for a lifeline, but none came. Even the chairman appeared uncertain how to intervene. The historical record supports the individual right interpretation when properly examined, Johnson finally said, though his tone lacked its earlier certainty. The founders clearly intended— I find that interesting, Mr. Speaker, Crockett interjected smoothly. because in your own legal brief in Sylvester vs. Becerra, you wrote that constitutional rights must be interpreted in light of changing circumstances and evolving understandings. That sounds very similar to the living constitutionalism you've often criticized. A low murmur spread across the room. Johnson's face reddened as Crockett held up a printed copy of the brief. This was no longer just about the Second Amendment. It was about exposing a contradiction in his entire constitutional framework. That statement was specific to that case, Johnson replied, voice strained. My overall philosophy remains originalist. So your originalism allows for evolving interpretations when it supports gun rights, Crockett asked evenly, but not when it supports other rights? That doesn't sound like a consistent legal philosophy. It sounds like selective application to achieve preferred outcomes. The shift in the hearing was complete. What had started as a predictable back and forth had turned into a precise dismantling of Johnson's core argument. With just one strategic question and a few pointed follow-ups, Crockett had exposed deep inconsistencies in his constitutional reasoning. Johnson's confidence had evaporated. He shuffled his papers, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't deepen the contradiction. Congresswoman, you're conflating different legal concepts, he said, forcing an authoritative tone. Originalism doesn't deny that applications of constitutional principles may address new situations. It only maintains that the underlying meaning remains fixed. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate that clarification. So, would it be accurate to say that you believe the Constitution's principles can apply to circumstances the founders couldn't have foreseen? Yes, within reason, Johnson answered, clearly relieved by the shift to generalities. That's interesting, Crockett replied, because when the Supreme Court used that same reasoning to recognize privacy rights in Griswold versus Connecticut, or to affirm equal protection for same-sex marriage in Obergefell versus Hodges, you called those decisions examples of judicial activism and runaway living constitutionalism. Yet you applaud that same interpretive flexibility when it expands Second Amendment rights beyond what was recognized for most of our history. The room went silent. A few Republican members looked down at their papers. Several Democrats tried to conceal their surprise at how effectively Crockett had turned Johnson's own arguments against him. Those cases involved creating rights not found in the text, Johnson replied, voice tense. The Second Amendment explicitly protects the right to bear arms. The 14th Amendment explicitly guarantees equal protection under the law, Crockett countered calmly. Yet when courts applied that clause to protect same-sex couples, you called it judicial activism. When courts reinterpreted the Second Amendment to recognize an individual right that wasn't acknowledged for 200 years, you called it proper originalism. The inconsistency speaks for itself. C-SPAN cameras caught Johnson loosening his tie as beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Chairman Jordan glanced at the clock, likely hoping Crockett's time was nearly up, but she still had over 2 minutes left. Mr. Speaker, Crockett continued, maintaining a professional tone, I'd like to enter into the record this 2019 speech in which you stated that the Constitution's meaning was fixed at ratification and should not change with judicial trends or political shifts. Do you still stand by that statement? Of course, Johnson replied, clearly grateful for what seemed to be an easier question. Crockett nodded, making a note as the room once again fell silent. Then I'm struggling to understand your position on the Second Amendment. If the Constitution's meaning was fixed at ratification and doesn't evolve, how do you justify supporting an interpretation that wasn't recognized for over 200 years after ratification? Doesn't that directly contradict your own stated principle? The trap had completely closed. Johnson was now caught in a dilemma of his own making. If he insisted that the Second Amendment had always protected an individual right despite centuries of different interpretations, he would undermine the core originalist belief that constitutional meaning is fixed and unchanging. But if he admitted that interpretations can evolve, he would contradict his lifelong legal philosophy, opening the door to the very constitutional theories he had long criticized. The historical record supports, Johnson began, but his voice faded as he realized the corner he had boxed himself into. Mr. Speaker, Crockett said, her tone composed yet firm. With all respect, it seems you apply originalism only when it aligns with your political goals, and set it aside when it doesn't. That's not constitutional fidelity, it's constitutional convenience, the gallery murmured. Journalists began typing rapidly, recognizing the significance of what had just happened. A freshman congresswoman had just dismantled the constitutional credibility of the Speaker of the House, using his own words and legal positions. Johnson's eventual response was weak. The courts have already settled this matter. Heller is the law of the land. Yes, it is, Crockett replied evenly, just as Obergefell is the law of the land on marriage equality, and Griswold on privacy rights. Yet you praise one while condemning the others, though all three represent evolving interpretations of constitutional text. The difference seems to lie not in your philosophy, but in your politics. She turned to the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. I'd like to submit for the record the Speaker's 2019 speech on originalism, his legal brief in Sylvester v. Becerra supporting evolving interpretations, and his public statements criticizing Obergefell and Griswold as judicial activism. Without objection, Chairman Jordan muttered, eager to move on. As the clerk collected the documents, the committee room stayed silent. Republican members avoided eye contact. Democrats exchanged quiet looks of amazement. Johnson sat stiffly, his earlier authority visibly diminished. The self-proclaimed constitutional expert had been exposed as inconsistent by a freshman lawmaker armed with nothing more than preparation and precision. The C-SPAN cameras captured everything. Johnson's confident start, Crockett's methodical questioning, and the gradual collapse of his credibility. Without raising her voice or attacking personally, Congresswoman Crockett had done what partisan opponents could not: challenge the very foundation of Johnson's authority using his own stated principles. Within minutes, clips flooded social media. Hashtags like Turn Crockett Question and Homer Johnson Stumped trended nationwide. The moment where Crockett asked about originalism and the Second Amendment reached over 1 million views on X within an hour. Political commentators rushed to analyze what had unfolded. On CNN, a legal panel broke it down. This was a masterclass in constitutional cross-examination, said one former federal judge. Crockett identified the contradiction in Johnson's legal philosophy and exposed it with surgical precision. No personal attack, just his own words turned inward. MSNBC's headline read, Speaker exposed, Johnson's constitutional contradictions revealed. Even on Fox News, commentators struggled to defend him. Johnson walked straight into a perfectly set trap, one conservative analyst admitted. If your entire political identity is built on originalism, you can't apply it selectively and still claim consistency. For the remainder of the hearing, Johnson's tone remained subdued. His responses to later questions lacked their earlier confidence. Fellow Republicans tried to toss him easy questions to help him recover, but the damage was clear. Every word now carried the weight of inconsistency. Outside, reporters crowded around Crockett. Congresswoman, did you expect the Speaker would struggle to reconcile his positions? One asked. Crockett's reply was calm and professional. My role on the Judiciary Committee is to ask substantive questions about constitutional interpretation, especially when it shapes laws that impact millions. Consistency in legal philosophy isn't partisan. It's essential to the rule of law. Her refusal to gloat made the exchange even more powerful. This wasn't a political ambush. It was a substantive demonstration of intellectual discipline. The fallout was swift. Democratic leaders began featuring clips of the exchange in messaging about Johnson's leadership. How can someone lead the House when their core principles change with political convenience? Asked the minority leader later that day. Johnson's office quickly released a statement claiming his words had been taken out of context, but the video evidence made that defense unconvincing. Law professors began citing the exchange in their lectures. One Harvard scholar told the Washington Post, "This will be a textbook example of exposing inconsistent legal reasoning, regardless of ideology." Even conservative legal groups struggled. The Federalist Society, which had frequently hosted Johnson, quietly postponed his next appearance. For Johnson, the exchange marked a turning point. His reputation as a constitutional authority had taken a serious hit. Each time he invoked originalism afterward, critics pointed back to Crockett's questioning as proof of selective application. News outlets continued analyzing the confrontation for days. The New York Times ran a piece titled, "When Originalism Meets Political Convenience, the Johnson contradiction. Even the Wall Street Journal, while sympathetic, acknowledged that Johnson had failed to explain his reasoning clearly under pressure. 2 weeks later, during a press briefing, a reporter asked him another constitutional question. Once eager to lecture on such matters, Johnson simply gave a short reply and deferred to the judiciary chair. His confidence in wielding constitutional arguments had clearly diminished. Meanwhile, Crockett's profile rose sharply. She received media invitations, law school speaking requests, and growing support from donors who saw her as a rising figure of integrity and precision. In her Texas district, constituents proudly shared clips of her performance. In a later interview, Crockett said, "This wasn't about partisanship, it was about constitutional consistency. We can disagree on interpretation methods, but we should at least apply our chosen approach consistently. Otherwise, it's not interpretation, it's rationalization." When asked if she had planned to trap the speaker, she smiled slightly. "I prepared thoroughly, as any good lawyer should." Speaker Johnson built his image on constitutional expertise. When that's your foundation, it's fair to test whether it's consistent or merely convenient. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson would later be studied in law and political science courses. It became a case study in effective questioning, constitutional coherence, and the danger of building a political identity on selectively applied principles. Months later, Johnson appeared at a conservative legal conference. When asked about the incident, he adopted a more careful stance, acknowledging that originalism requires deep historical context and can sometimes lead to unexpected outcomes. It was a more nuanced explanation, but it lacked the certainty that once defined his rhetoric. For Crockett, the exchange symbolized something greater than political victory. It proved that well-prepared, informed questioning can reveal truths beyond talking points. From then on, witnesses and lawmakers alike approached her with visible caution, aware of her precision and consistency. The Crockett-Johnson exchange came to represent something rare in modern politics, a moment where substance prevailed over spectacle, where thoughtful questioning cut deeper than performance, and where consistency outweighed convenience. If you found this breakdown of how Congresswoman Crockett challenged Speaker Johnson insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And stay tuned for our next video, 5 questioning techniques from Jasmine Crockett you can use in real life.